You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 4th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, India starts counting votes after the 6-week electoral process. And
I've changed my mind because I can't let down millions of people who would feel let down by me unless I was at the front and led this charge over the course of the next 5.5 years.
Hours after a poll threatening the UK's ruling Conservatives with an existential crisis, Nigel Farage re-enters the fray to make Rishi Sunak's election prospects even more dire. We'll continue with our series on the EU elections.
What we are afraid of is that this new management, they will push some ideology into our broadcasting and they will not let us freedom.
We'll look at the potential breakup of Belgium and we'll take you to the moon and back. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. In India, the world's biggest election was held in 7 phases over 6 weeks. Almost 1 billion people were eligible to vote. And today, as counting begins, we find out how many actually did and who they voted for. I'm joined now by Maya Sharma, who's a journalist based in Bengaluru. Maya, many thanks for coming back on the show. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi looks to be on course for a 3rd consecutive term for himself and his BJP party. Nevertheless, this is looking less like the landslide that was predicted. Can you tell us about the results so far?
Well, absolutely fascinating election results so far. Counting is, of course, still going on. But with electronic voting machines, we are expecting a very clear, definite answer by later this evening. And the leadings coming in are extremely interesting. It does indeed look as if Narendra Modi and the BJP will be able to form the government once again along with their allies. But everything has a context. And considering how invulnerable the BJP was looking, what a strong man Narendra Modi was looking, and how many thought it was going to be an absolutely landslide victory, the results, the leadings coming in are extremely interesting indeed. The opposition India alliance, with the Congress also as one of the major players, has been putting up a very good fight indeed. So while the BJP currently has leadings in about 200 in the late 200s, the India alliance has also crossed 200 seats in the 543-member House. So while it's very possible that the BJP will be able to form the government, it's not looking as if it will get a majority by itself and will have to rely on its allies. And that itself is a huge development because exit polls which came out also forecast a massive BJP victory. So it does look as if the feeling that perhaps there was a chipping away of the absolutely invulnerability of the BJP, maybe that feeling on the ground was indeed valid. And by the end of the day, the results may be very surprising indeed.
How many seats does a party or an alliance need to form a government?
There are 543 members in the House of Parliament, the Lok Sabha, the lower house of Parliament. The halfway mark for that would be 272. So the BJP and its allies need to cross that 272. Right now, the BJP is hovering around 240, 250. So they're likely to be able to get that. One of their allies in the south of India, in Andhra Pradesh, has done pretty well. So they will have to rely on Chandrababu Naidu and his followers to help make the numbers. In other places as well, they have done better than planned, as better than expected, like in Odisha. But they will have to rely on their allies. It's looking more and more that way to get past the 272 mark. It should be likely, but the very fact that we're even talking about combinations and the fact that it's a probability rather than a certainty, that itself is the big news of the day. 272 should be reached, but it will be. They'll know they'll have been in a fight.
What was the turnout in what was obviously a very challenging and huge logistical voting process?
The overall average turnout may have been just in the early 60s, just above 60%. Some states, of course, like West Bengal, crossed 80% voting. urban areas like Delhi, Bengaluru, Mumbai didn't see great turnout, and that has been the pattern over the years. The urban areas are a little more apathetic when it comes to actually voting. Plus, also, there was a massive heat wave across India. It's still on in parts of the country. And getting people out to vote in that heat has been a huge challenge. And sadly, many polling officers, people on duty to conduct the polls, many of them have died of heat stroke, which is a very terrible thing indeed. So that was a huge challenge also. But overall, above 60%, which internationally may not be a bad record, but Indians do tend to be involved in their elections, and a higher turnout was in fact hoped for.
And I understand the counting process too is being affected by extreme weather.
Well, it is slower. We do have EVMs, electronic voting machines. So the voting process is much faster than in places where paper ballots are still being counted. But it is slower than expected. Usually by noon, by early afternoon, you have a very clear idea of which way the results are actually going. But right now, very few results have come in, maybe about 20 or 30 actual results have come in. The leadings are what are being considered at the moment. But sometimes when the lead is huge, hundreds of thousands of votes, then you know that the candidate is really going to win. But it has been a much slower process today than it has been in the past. But by the end of the day, we'll certainly have most of the results out for sure, except in places where perhaps malpractice is alleged and recounting is asked for.
So tell us about malpractice. I mean, is this generally thought to have been free and fair? And are the results likely to provoke unrest at all?
Well, as the campaign was going on, there were growing concerns about just how free and fair this election was. One problem was the Election Commission. It was not quite deemed to be absolutely neutral. There were allegations that it was in fact favouring the ruling BJP. Two of the members of the Election Commission were brought in just before the election began, in fact, and there was a concern that they were perhaps not being as strict with BJP people who violated the model code of conduct as they should be. There was a lot of hate speech that went on in this election, a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric, and apart from a very mild slap on the wrist for the BJP party president being told to keep his star campaigners in check, very little else was done. So that was one area of concern, the fairness of the Election Commission. Also, there were videos shared. There were allegations of the electronic voting machines themselves being tampered with, of people casting multiple votes, of electronic voting machines being stored secretly somewhere else. There was a lot of concern. Predictably, as the result seems to be not quite so one-sided as was thought, those allegations are reducing, but there were concerns about as to how totally free and fair this election was indeed.
Maya, thank you very much indeed. That was Maya Sharma, and I'm sure we'll be checking in with her again very soon. Now, here's Vincent McAvaney with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. President Joe Biden is expected to issue a sweeping new executive order aimed at curbing migrant arrivals at the US-Mexico border. Under the planned order, US officials could swiftly deport migrants who enter the US illegally without processing their asylum requests once a daily threshold is met. Hong Kong police have detained artist San Mu Chen after he appeared to write 8964 in the air with his hand, a reference to the date of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which occurred 35 years ago today. Public acknowledgement of the events of the 4th of June 1989, when Chinese soldiers killed thousands of peaceful protesters, is banned in mainland China and increasingly sensitive in Hong Kong. Results of a clinical trial show the world's first personalised mRNA cancer vaccine for melanoma halves the risk of patients dying or the disease returning. Melanoma affects more than 150,000 people a year globally. Doctors have described the breakthrough as extremely impressive. And D-Day veterans have departed the UK for France to join commemorations marking the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings. About 25 former servicemen in their late 90s are making the ferry crossing from Portsmouth. It's thought this will be the last milestone anniversary, which will have surviving veterans in attendance in a meaningful way. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Vincent. Last month's assassination attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico sent shockwaves across Europe and pointed to growing political polarisation in the small Central European country. In its wake, both government and opposition called for calm and an end to inflammatory rhetoric. But despite this, there are fears that the shooting will give new impetus to Fico's vision of a more authoritarian and less democratic Slovakia that's at odds with broader European politics. Monocle's Alexei Koryolov reports from the Slovak capital, Bratislava.
To say that Slovakia is a nation divided is an understatement. For months, Prime Minister Robert Fico had been chipping away at the country's democratic institutions and denigrating his opponents with increasingly abusive language.
Right now they are shouting, Fico to the jail, Fico to the jail.
For months, there'd been mass protests against him. And then, 3 weeks ago, Fico's allies immediately declared that the attack was the result of a climate of hate created by the liberal opposition. The opposition countered that it was the government that was fostering division. How did we get here? Miloslav Bachna is a sociologist at the Slovak Academy of Sciences.
Well, the events, I would kind of start with the murder of the young journalist Jan Kuciak, continuing via the COVID pandemic, and also there was this assassination of the two LGBT people from the LGBT community, which was very clearly kind of blamed by the current opposition on the current government, like this is your fault because you created this mood in the society, and now it's basically coming back. We are seeing the reverse now. Now those who opposed, like it's not our fault that this crazy person has been shooting in the street, and now they're using it like you said that about us, so now we are saying that about you, that it's your fault.
Verejnoprávne médiá musia zabezpečovať nezávislú a objektívnu žurnalistiku.
The attempt on Fico's life happened on the day the Slovak parliament began debating his most recent proposal to restructure the country's public broadcaster, RTVS, and put it under effective government control.
I'm Sonia Vajsova. I'm the head of World News Desk at Radio RTVS, which is public broadcaster.
And I'm Ondrej Starinsky. I'm the head of documentary at Slovak Television, which is part of Radio and Television Slovakia.
As RTVS employees, Sonia Vajsova and Ondrej Starinsky are worried.
What I say and what we are afraid of is that this new management, they will push some ideology into our broadcasting, that they will be not just managers and they will not let us freedom, but that they will push the narratives spread by this government, for example, towards war in Ukraine, towards European Union, towards NATO allies, but as well that they will somehow push some censorship in domestic news.
But people are concerned, it seems like, because there have been protests. So do you, as representatives of this organization, of this brand, feel the support of at least a part of the population, or do you feel like you're being left completely alone?
We kind of feel the support of like the general part of the general public, and the other part that sympathizes with coalition parties is being kind of misinformed or brainwashed that we are somehow partisan and that we are making content which is favoring the opposition. Of course, it's not true. So at this point, I feel that the people maybe who are more critical are being louder, which is also because of assassination attempt that we kind of suspended a lot of activities.
But as European elections approach, will the fallout from the assassination attempt translate into even more support for Robert Fico and his Smer party? Sociologist Miloslav Bachna says it's likely, but points out that this wouldn't necessarily mean an increase in Euroscepticism. For one, the liberal and pro-EU Progressive Slovakia party is expected to make a strong showing. And as for the Slovak population at large, it is not so much Eurosceptic as Euro-indifferent.
No, there's no major party actually saying that we should leave the European Union and that we would be better about. Generally, I don't know if you know, but Slovakia has been a record holder for having the lowest participation in European elections. I think 2 previous elections was either the country with the lowest participation or the second lowest, if I remember correctly. I would assume the results will be rather an indicator of how much has the assassination attempt changed and mobilized the respective political kind of camps which we have in Slovakia. So if there will be more or less convincing victory of the Smer party, then there will be the message that definitely the assassination attempt helped to mobilize and rally around the flag of those people who had some sympathies for Robert Fico and his party. But regards to lessons like further on, I would say that's too far away, and let's see what happens in the meantime.
For Monocle in Bratislava, I'm Alexei Korolev.
Many thanks, Alexei. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. In a month's time, the United Kingdom will go to the polls, and this evening, the first of several television debates will go ahead. Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, the leaders of the ruling Conservatives and the opposition Labour Party, respectively, will go head-to-head in Salford. I'm joined now by Jim Waterson, who's political media editor at The Guardian. Jim, many thanks for coming on the show. What are the advance polls saying?
Well, the polls at the moment are showing that it's going to be a Labour majority for Sir Keir Starmer's party. And the only question now that people are covering is how bad is the Tory defeat going to be? So we've got this strange situation of we're playing out the way a normal UK election campaign runs out. But really, we're already looking at the aftermath.
And Nigel Farage and his shock announcement, how might that influence it?
If anything, that's going to probably have an effect around the fringes. But due to the way that the UK elects its MPs, if you start to lose a few percentage points at the bottom of your rating, suddenly a small landslide victory turns into a massive landslide victory. And really, the risk for the Conservatives now is that Nigel Farage just makes the final 4 weeks of this campaign entirely about him, eats into their vote and gives Labour an even bigger victory and leaves Farage to pick up the pieces on the right afterwards.
So if Farage gains a seat, there is a theory that he may then defect to the Conservatives and then possibly run for the leadership of the party. I wonder if you could unpack that idea for us. Is it at all likely?
Well, I think that's the sort of thing that political journalists get a lot of fun out of writing. It sort of turns into the equivalent of fan fiction where people play fantasy politics. In reality, there's probably ways to stopping Farage joining the Conservatives. The question is, if he gets into Parliament and the odds are on him finally doing it, I think the 8th attempt, then does he manage to woo over 20 or 30 Tory MPs to his sort of further right version of conservatism? And how does Keir Starmer rule in a Parliament where he might have 400 MPs, some of whom are quite troublesome? So it is quite a strange election because it feels that with a month to go, everyone has completely written off Rishi Sunak, and it's already turning into a who's going to have power after the election rather than what the result might be, which is a dangerous place sometimes for journalists because we can sometimes get ahead of event. No one's voted yet. No one, not even the postal votes have gone out yet.
Yeah. Let's have a look at these TV debates then. How are they conducted?
Well, the TV debates, which are a pretty recent innovation in the UK, the first ones are only in 2010, and there's a slightly tedious process to arranging them back and forth. And this time, Labour has said very simply, Labour are the ones who've got most to lose by slipping up in a TV debate. So they said, right, we will do 2 head-to-head with Rishi Sunak, cut all the smaller parties out, and that's what they've got. So essentially, the broadcasters have agreed to what Labour want as the sort of government in waiting. So we'll have 2 head-to-head debates. TV ratings, obviously, around the world are going down, so there's probably only going to be 3 or 4 million people watching tonight, whereas 10, 15 years ago, you might have had 10 million. But they'll still set the tone for the next few days. But again, I think all the media coverage has been upended by Nigel Farage, the ultimate showman. He'll try and distract everyone, make it all about him. And even though his party might not get much in the way of the vote, because the attention is already shifting to what happens after the election, he's going to suck up a lot of the airtime.
I wonder how tech advances have influenced the way the election's being covered. As you say, TV viewership is going down, but other forms are coming up.
Really, what's strange about this election is that in 2015, 2017, 2019, it was all about Facebook. Facebook was the big new thing. Everyone had it installed on their phones. You could go viral with a story on there, and it was relatively easy to work out what was going on. And now what's happened is a sort of real gloopy mess of various different forms of communication, which, as someone whose job is to try and work out what people are talking about in this election, it makes it incredibly hard. So you've got the family WhatsApp group where people are posting memes. You've got the kids are hanging out on TikTok, but does that actually sway any votes? Because most of them are already voting Labour or Labour or Labour friendly at best. And it's really hard to put a pin on where people are getting their news from, because it's such a sort of chaotic mix. It's not just one broadcast outlet, one newspaper, or one social platform. It's a bit of everything, and it varies wildly according to age bracket.
I wonder how important print still is, and why we haven't yet seen the major Murdoch newspapers nailing their colours to the mast yet.
Well, the Murdoch papers, who sort of have this sort of incredible self-image of being able to call and sway British general elections, they've built that up over many years. Infamously, in 1992, The Sun claimed that it was The Sun what won it for the Conservatives when they had an unlikely victory, and The Sun came all out for them. But all the right-wing papers are sort of facing their own mortality a bit. Their sales are well down. And they are trying to work out if they can still have influence on the Tories and really what that even means. So with the Murdoch papers, The Sun and The Times' readership is swinging heavily behind Labour, and The Sun's readership is swinging Labour, even if its sort of editorial position is still a bit suspect and critical of Keir Starmer. I would expect you see a sort of slightly bland endorsement of change without necessarily fully endorsing Labour, although the Times might choose to jump. Either way, you've got to remember some of the history here. Keir Starmer led the prosecutions against Rupert Murdoch's executives during the phone hacking saga, and there is a lot of bad blood there that still needs to be buried.
Now, for the first time, citizens will need photo ID to vote. Some predict that this will be a problem. Why so, and which demographic might it affect?
Well, this is the jury's still slightly out, because for the first sort of proper election with photo ID in the UK, until recently, you could just turn up, say your name at a polling station in the UK, and they would hand over your polling card. There were no checks to say that you were the person who you said you were. That's changed. You now need to have ID. And some people are missing out on the ability to vote because of it. Originally, there was a sort of fear that this would hit young people and people from minority backgrounds. Some of the evidence suggests actually it affects older people who might not have to have ID in other walks of life and are finding they're not voting. So something introduced by the Conservative Party might end up hitting their older support base. But, it's still a bit too early, and we haven't had enough elections to really see what the actual impact will be. And we don't know whether, if there's a low turnout election, that's because of apathy, people assuming the result is a foregone conclusion, or because of something like this with ID.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. That's Jim Waterson, and you're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, as we were discussing earlier, there are 7 weeks until the European elections. But in Belgium, they'll also be electing MPs for 7 different parliaments. The federal vote is the one that most locals are discussing, as there's a possibility the future of the country may be at stake because of the potential breakaway of Flanders, the Flemish north part of the country. Jack Parrock, a Brussels-based correspondent, joins us now. Jack, why is this federal vote of particular importance? Just give us the detail on that, if you would.
It's a really significant vote, and Belgium has incredibly complex politics. The way we have to think about the Belgian elections essentially is 2 separate countries voting together to try and find a federal government. That's Flanders, which has about 6.5 million people in it, the Dutch-speaking, the Flemish-speaking region, and the 3.5 million size Wallonian region, the French-speaking region. Now, as you say, it's predicted that a far-right party are going to take the most seats overall in the federal parliament, 26. That's the Vlaams Belang party in the polls are looking to take the most, 26 out of about 150 seats. And it's raising concerns that because of their ideas about removing Flanders, this Flemish-speaking region, from the rest of the country, that can be potentially back on the cards after the elections. It's important to say that that party will only gain votes in the Flemish-speaking region and not in the French-speaking region. That's why we talk about these sort of two separate elections that happen and sort of combine together.
What would happen if Flanders became independent?
Well, it would then take over control of its economics. One of the things that is really key is that the Flemish region is now the economic driver of Belgium, whereas in the past, in the Industrial Revolution, it was the French-speaking Wallonian region. And that's why they want to leave the Union. The big question is, how could it possibly happen? Because there's so much intertwined and intertangled setup in the Belgian political system that it would be extremely complicated. They want, Vlaams Belang, the far-right party, want a clear separation away from the rest of Belgium. But there are other Flemish nationalist parties, like the New Flemish Alliance, who are pressing for a more of a sort of confederal system where everybody sort of stays together broadly, but the real power would instead move to Antwerp to make decisions on things like schooling, on all of the different economic decisions that happen in a country. That would be complex, though, and there is a lot of opposition in the rest of the main political parties, your centre-right, your socialist, your liberal, your green parties. None of them would like to see Flanders leave, and they will be the overwhelming majority, we expect, after the elections.
So, I mean, is this a realistic proposition? And if it did have, how quickly could Antwerp get it together to govern and fund itself?
Yeah, probably would take quite a long time. One sort of point of caution here is, while they are making a lot of noise and while they are predicted to surge in the polls, if you look back at reporting from the Belgian elections from the 1970s and 1980s even, Flemish secession was the topic then as well. This is a constant in Belgian politics, that there is a large faction of Flemish people who feel that Brussels doesn't listen to them. And specifically at the moment, what Vlaams Belang, the far-right party that are campaigning on this for, is an anti-immigration policy. And that is gaining voters. They feel that if Flanders could go independent from the rest of Belgium, that these far-right parties will be able to prevent immigration into Flanders. And that's the biggest concern for a lot of the voters up there. How quickly it could happen? Hard to tell. As I say, this has been a discussion for decades upon decades, and it's never happened yet.
Jack, thank you. That was Jack Parag. And to end the programme, let's take you out of this world. Dr. David Whitehouse, space scientist and author, joins us now. David, lovely to have you back on the show. The Chinese Space Agency says a probe carrying samples from the far side of the moon has begun its journey back to Earth. Now, this is very significant. Tell us more.
Well, it is, because not only is this important for the understanding and exploration of the moon, we've never had samples from the very curious far side of the moon, and the samples have been collected over the past few days, and they have taken off from the surface. And over the next few days, the spacecraft will rendezvous with the return capsule, and it'll probably come back to Earth in about 3 weeks' time. And we've never had samples from this, so it's very exciting. But it's also symbolic for the Chinese space effort as they carry on their long-term plan to, well, they don't regard anything as acceptable other than being first in so many fields. So it's their long-term plan to become the world's leading spacefaring nation, overtaking the United States.
And how practical, how essential is the information we may receive from these samples?
Well, the far side of the moon is... it's not dark, as most people say. It's as dark as the near side. It has day and night time, but we can't see it from the Earth, and therefore operating on the far side is difficult because there's no line of sight, so you need a relay satellite. It landed in the depths of quite a very large crater that was excavated by a giant impact billions of years ago, and therefore on the surface there are rocks and samples that came from deep within the moon. And this is one of the few places on the moon where you can get access to these rocks, and they carry with them chemical and other signatures of what it was like when the solar system was young, information that's been lost from the surface of our planet by weathering. So these are important samples that tell us about the history of the moon, the Earth, and the solar system.
Fascinating. Now, the Starliner spacecraft will attempt to launch tomorrow. That's according to NASA and Boeing. What is it and why was it postponed?
Well, this is the first flight of the Starliner capsule, which is to take astronauts into space to the International Space Station. It's been many years in the design, and it's had various technical problems all along. And it tried to launch just over a week ago, but there was a computer problem. Tomorrow's is the next attempt. And it's important because it's a very sophisticated, very agile, versatile spacecraft. And it means that NASA will have two ways to send astronauts to the space station. At the moment, they use SpaceX's Dragon capsule, but you cannot have all your eggs in one basket. If that capsule or the SpaceX system doesn't work, you cannot leave your astronauts in space without being supported. So this is the alternative, and hopefully it will fly with Sunita and Barry on it tomorrow and be the first of regular trips, not only to the International Space Station, but also to what it replaces the space station in years to come.
Now, launches into space may soon change location. New Zealand is inviting aerospace firms from around the world to set up at a new National Aerospace Centre on the east coast of the South Island. What's the detail on that?
Well, this is the Electron rocket, which is actually quietly over the last few years, it's notched up 42 successful launches with only a few failures. It's a small rocket to launch small payloads, which is a growing part of the satellite industry. More people want to not be part of a great, big, massive satellite, but launch their individual kit on an individual payload. And New Zealand has got many advantages. It not only is very south, it's got access to interesting orbits, scientific orbits, but it's in the middle of nowhere in the sense that it's a safe launch site. You launch over water, not many flights by aeroplanes over that particular region. And New Zealand wants to build up the ecology and the technology and all that's associated with that to develop a high-tech job sector. And they've now shown they can do it, and they're appealing to the rest of the world to say, come and join us.
David Whitehouse, thank you very much indeed. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Vincent McAvenny. Our researcher was Gryna Gunlad, and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.